Hello there. I just wanted to go over where I'm currently stuck. As a searcher of the truth and someone who is not married to any conclusions at all, with all my beliefs being tentative and a non expert, I have an interest in and an intuition of what's going on with the destruction of the World Trade Center on 9/11. Now, to me, it's what's been investigated by official people is what caused the collapse initiation, meaning there's a certain part where the airplane's impacted, obviously, and there was fire subsequently for extended duration, which weakened the steel support that was exposed to the heat, with fireproofing dislodged. I'll happily grant all of this. Um, so let's say the impact destroyed a bunch of supporting structure, and then the fire didn't melt the steel but weakened it sufficiently to so that it was unable to hold the structure above. Fine. That's there's problems with that. But that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is what happened after. What happened after was the towers, both of them, were totally destroyed completely. No real standing structure remaining. All floors pulverized, disintegrated. Now, how and why, though? What are the alternatives? Maybe the top portion could have collapsed slowly and stopped. Maybe it could have fallen off to the side, since the damage was asymmetrical, meaning uneven. So there were some columns that were stronger than others. It wasn't like the plane magically, just in the fire, magically destroyed every column exactly. So why wasn't there offset? Or maybe it could have collapsed a little and stopped halfway through. So what is the model for how the whole thing collapsed so rapidly and completely? What do the experts are saying? Is there an expert consensus on this? So this is what I wanted to know. Just what is even the theory? There's a mathematical collapse progression, but the problem with that very early mathematical collapse progression is it doesn't align with the footage, and it doesn't address the empirical features of the collapse, the ejection of the debris horizontally, the speed, all these other things. It also assumes an intact upper portion, pile driving, which doesn't really align. There was a pancaking theory that was early on by this JOM and FEMA, assuming that the trusses themselves failed, because there's floor trusses and then there's vertical columns. If the trusses themselves were heated and they failed, they could pancake down. But that would leave the core structure intact. And it wouldn't have been as rapid. It would have been boom, 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 boom. And that was actually disproven. So nobody even believes that anymore, even officially. There was another insurance investigation for Silverstein. It just ruled out design flaws. And then in 2004, a guy named Jim Hoffman made a progressive collapse challenge. He's like, look, I don't even think this is possible in principle to have a structure that's 6.5 times tall as it is wide, that's square, at three-dimensional, that is disturbed at the top and then just collapses like dominoes or a stack of cards. A stack of cards can do it, but that stack of cards can't survive in 100 mile per hour equivalent crosswinds. So you would obviously adjust that for scale, since these were huge towers. And there was also the square cube law. So you would have to, for any model that you create, you would have to factor those strengths and weaknesses in as well. But his collapse is his challenge is much more broad, and he starts it in stages. So it goes from easier to more difficult as he includes features that better align with these giant structures. And so in 2005 and 2008, we had the official reports on the collapse initiation, but their investigation stopped once it initiated, meaning they just assumed that the resistance provided by the intact structure below failed to stop or even slow the collapse progression. This is where all official government bodies and official institutional stances end. There's nobody's besides internet debunkers or AE 9/11 truthers are even looking into this. But that's where all the anomalies are, and that's what's the sticking point for me. Is I can't even refer to an authority here on how it happened. Everyone's throwing up their hands and saying, well, gravity did it. Gravitational overload. Yeah, well, there's problems with that. And there's an alternative hypothesis that the intact structure below the resistance was artificially removed as opposed to gravitationally overloaded by the top portion falling onto it. And for me, it's even worse because I don't even know if it's possible. And that's the biggest problem. What would be sufficient to prove the gravitational overload is even possible in principle? For me, any simulation of a gravity-driven progressive collapse of a similar 3D structure that demonstrates the characteristic observable phenomenon, like there have been people that tried doing it and they'll like have, some wood boards or something, and then the wood boards all end up in a nice neat pile and none of the debris was distributed. There was a slowdown, observable jolt. There's the issue still remains. So especially in 2025, I would accept any digital model or physical model. And obviously, the closer it resembles the structure of the towers, the better. One minor note here is that the way the structure was built, the thinnest steel was at the top and the thicker steel for the columns was at the bottom. And maybe in another video I'll go into the issues with the collapse initiation, but there's some odd issues with their explanations that almost needlessly make the arguments for them worse, like especially with Building 7. A lot of debunkers say, well, look, it was totally damaged by the collapsing debris. I'm talking about World Trade Center 7. But in the final report from NIST, they say that had nothing to do with it. So it sort of takes the wind out of the sails of some people trying to make the case that it was a gravity-driven accidental thing. Their hypothesis almost makes it more easy to be debunked or to bring in the artificial removal hypothesis here. And we're not talking about the forensic evidence yet. I was using GPT 303 to really go into the nitty-gritty of that, and it was much superior to the other LLM feedbacks, a lot more technical, a lot more detail. And so I knew for me that even absent the forensic evidence, what really gets my intuition is the issues with of what we saw. And I also wanted to point out that, there's a guy named Ron Hamburger who was he thought it was a demolition on the first day and then did a 180 the next day. And then he wrote this paper saying why, institutions aren't supporting the artificial removal theory. And he was saying that, there's a very small ratio of the experts. They say they have 3,500, but if you look at the number of physics engineers, Institute of Architecture members, New York physical engineers, it's a small proportion out of the thousands that exist. And I wanted to address that because what is left out of this critique is how many of those individuals took the time to investigate this issue or know that there's even a gap. They probably saw, oh, NIST did their investigation. It's 10,000 pages. They figured it out. I trust NIST. Do they know that they didn't investigate the progression, only the initiation? Did they know that the most mainstream progression mathematical model doesn't address any of the empirical features? It's just an internally consistent model that makes a bunch of assumptions that don't align with the footage. So to me, that doesn't really do much, and it doesn't help me as somebody who wants to understand either way. Now, to underscore my point, the collapse progression, including the observable phenomenon of the collapse, was not addressed or analyzed by any professional institution. ASCE, NIST, FEMA. There's a lot of debunkers out there of the debunk people that their whole modus operandi is to debunk conspiracies of all shapes and sizes. Mick West, Michael Shermer, Edward Current, and then even Saban, who's not a debunker but a physics guy or engineering guy, took their stab. They are taking their stabs in all different directions to try to debunk these things. And, they cover all the different areas, but what I'm focusing on is this collapse progression. And then even Bazan, I wanted to mention, he's not representing an institution. He's just an independent researcher with as much validity as anybody in the AE 9/11 Truth signatory. So what are my issues exactly? And, I'm going to utilize O3 LLMs to make this case much stronger. This is really, left over from the previous video. We have observable phenomenon. This observable phenomenon is not part of the initiation. There are other observable phenomena that are part of the initiation that is part of a different argument. This is about the collapse progression. And we have these two competing hypotheses here. The gravitational overload as an explanation for why this intact structure did not provide resistance, or an artificial removal of that resistance to allow for these features, these observable phenomena. Rapid initiation and progression. With, the building survived the plane impact. The fire slowly weakened all the other columns. But instead of slowly, with large deformations, collapsing, it just went from intact to now we're falling at near free fall speed. Everything's blowing up. And, people tried to do debunking arguments using like a Coke can or like a one column, saying, look, once you remove other support, it just suddenly falls. Yeah, that's assuming only one support, not all like 47 or whatever the number is. There's a lot. The vertical symmetry, uniform descent. The problem is that both towers, 2 and 1, started tilting. 1 is a little less obvious from most camera angles, but 2 started falling, and then the whole thing, because I guess center of gravity or whatever, it just the rest of the progression of the rest of the tower all the way down was symmetrical, a uniform descent. There was no observable deceleration. Now, this will be interesting. The footage I saw that was actually measured for the type of controlled demolition where they don't even use explosives, they just remove the support from the center of the building and let the top portion collapse onto the bottom. The ones I saw that were measured did have a measurable deceleration. Maybe I didn't look through all of them. Maybe there's some where there isn't. But definitely hasn't been formally investigated by anyone besides the conspiracy crowd. High-speed lateral ejection of debris. The debunkers are trying their best to address this. Could have been happened by accident, but some went really far. And it was really heavy components. So it's compared to the artificial removal hypothesis, it doesn't fit as well by comparison. None of the gravitational overload, I mean, it could be possible. I don't know. But if I'm comparing to this is a better fit given what I know. I'm open to revision on this. The debris distribution, 80% outside the footprint. Same thing. Complete structural failure. The completeness of it is the problem. Partial is one thing. And also the pulverization, especially the pulverization mid-air. One thing that's crazy to me is that the top portion of the South Tower, you can try to observe it through the smoke. It goes from being completely intact to just dust. Startlingly so. The upper block of Tower 1 appears to disintegrate before it could transfer impulse. That's the technical way of saying, transfer that destructive energy to the floors beneath. And not just the trusses, also the columns, especially the core column, which the core column's weird because like a huge portion of it remained intact and then it fell symmetrically down after, which has not been addressed. I'm not an expert. It just doesn't seem intuitive to me as a non-expert, and I don't have experts to go to explain it. And it would be one thing if, I know it's an extraordinary event, and so intuitions aren't as helpful in these extreme situations. But the fact that experts are kind of dodging it or haven't addressed it or are making huge assumptions when really that's the main problem is that the whole thing got destroyed. Like that was like, if we want an answer to the question, I mean, it's much more obvious that this, a collapse would initiate. So what's all the big deal about going through 10,000 pages and $16 million to prove that? That's not the hard part to grasp. The hard part to grasp is that the whole thing just exploded in like 15 seconds. The observed dynamics challenge the current simplified modeling assumptions, and there may be premature closure in the absence of empirical validation. It hasn't been empirically verified, period. So this is from my previous slide. I just reformatted it here. What's not adding up? Structural dynamics, meaning action, movement, lack of jolt, no deceleration, symmetrical free fall like descent. Fracture mechanics, the early disintegration of the falling mass. There's no coherent collapse interface because, floors falling on floors or columns hitting floors, the whole perimeter of every single truss moving that fast. Is it just like a ball of debris striking, and then is the outside like peeling off like a zipper? I've heard that from debunkers or official proponents. The impulse transfer, unclear whether sufficient impulse ever passed from top to bottom. I mean, there had to have been some. But continuum mechanics, simplified treatment of complex heterogeneous structure as a lump mass. Collapse propagation, no empirical verification of gravity-driven top-down global collapse of a steel skyscraper. I mean, this should be trivial for people who have computers that simulate collapses. I YouTubed, I'm like looking for people trying, and I saw these simulations where they adjust the parameters, and then there's some where like it just blows up but there's like stack of cards. It's hard to trust something that looks nothing like what we saw in 9/11 that like has stack of card features. It's like, did you really model the actual strengths of each component sufficiently, and versus how it was built? It was really funny when Saban had his. The top portion totally slows to a stop. in his explanation of how the towers were destroyed. Um, the pulverization and the lateral ejection. So it's one thing if you're like dropping it from 1,000 feet and then all the concrete just pulverizes. Fine, you have plenty of momentum and energy there. But like it starts pulverizing like the second it slowly starts moving, and it accelerates and pulverizes. So usually there's enough energy to do one or the other, because in order to maintain free fall acceleration, that takes all the kinetic energy. So if some of the kinetic energy is absorbed in a destructive force, that would involve a slowdown of the top bottom motion. So anyway, I just wanted to vent on this. This was I kind of put this together just really quick. It's not a formal argument. I went on Mick West's forum Metabunk, and there's lots of people discussing this, trying to solve this progressive collapse challenge. Actually, let me try and pull that up right here. So I have a million pictures because now I'm back into this again. Here's Mick West. He's trying to make this challenge happen. As you could see, he has this very two-dimensional structure, ridiculously flimsy, and to make it let's see, does it say in the challenge with a square footprint? This doesn't have a square footprint, so you're already lost on challenge 2. It's really tricky. Lateral ejection, persistent heat, destruction details. So yeah, a blurry image, but you can sort of see this core is thick, like just full of redundant structure. All of this is like netted and interlaced. So, which is why it stood for so long after it got hit by a plane, because it can redistribute loads. And then all of these trusses, they're all interconnected, interwoven for every single floor. And so, if you have asymmetric damage, like let's say half of this is destroyed here, and then some of these floors are sagging here and some are sagging here, the whole thing's not just going to start exploding. Here's the South Tower, and as you can see, the top portion, it's not too crazy to imagine that, starting to fracture a little. But see, this is the early, if I had the footage, you could see that once it gets about down to here, I'm using my hand to reference the screen. It's already pulverized. Oh, you can't really see. That's not a good picture, but I've been over that before. One thing to note, and like we could do a before after here. So here's before, as you can see, Tower 7, 1, and 2. It is awful. They're 100% flattened. And I'm still waiting on an explanation from anybody. Like, I don't even care if it's from a rando on the internet. I just want it to make sense at some way, somehow. There's been, check this out. There's a really good, here we go. There's a really good timeline here of the arguments between engineers on this topic. Of course, I can't find it now. But I have quite a bit of... Oh, it was in here. As you can see, I have way too many things, and I'm trying to organize it better here. But even the official versions, they go back and forth on, was it a truss failure? Was it a column failure? External column, internal column? There's evidence that it was an internal column, but that's besides the point. I was trying to find. Is it in here possibly? Well, there's a really good explanation of how there's not really a consensus because there's professionals arguing about it. Yeah, I'll save that for another video. I made my point here. Thanks for listening.